Hello, everybody. It's Philip Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. Today is the 2nd of May, 2021, and the topic is racism, California versus the Deep South. So let me pull up my notes and we'll go ahead and get started. Although I've had many wonderful experiences in California, the last time I was in Silicon Valley, a guy at a gas station took great offense at my Southern accent. At the time, I merely assumed the fellow was having a bad day, but since then, the Golden State's public-facing personalities have become even more sanctimonious about so-called critical race theory and the alleged systemic racism in America. They act as if anyone who denies that America is systemically racist is a fit object for contempt and ridicule. Those with Southern accents are assumed to be irredeemables, forever unable to mitigate the alleged racism deeply embedded in our DNA. Nonetheless, an honest look at California's historical racism might cause jaws to drop everywhere. Consider, for example, that the state did not approve the 15th Amendment, providing blacks the right to vote until 1962, almost a century after it was ratified. Similarly, California did not approve the 14th Amendment until 1959, also a century late. California's 14th Amendment approval delay reveals the state's most blatant historical racism, which was chiefly against Asians. Blacks represented less than 1% of the state's population until 1910 and did not exceed 2% until World War II. In contrast, when the 14th Amendment was adopted in 1868, Chinese Americans composed 9% of the state's populations. Californians particularly objected to the amendment's provision granting citizenship to anyone born in the USA because they did not want Asians to have a right to vote, even though they were less than 10% of the population in California. Notwithstanding that Chinese Americans never composed more than 10% of the state's populations, Californians successfully lobbied the federal government to get laws to negate the amendment's birthright citizenship as it would apply to Asians. First, the language of the 1870 Naturalization Act did not allow Chinese Americans to become naturalized citizens. It was instead targeted at blacks that had been born outside the United States because they composed the solitary racial minority that would reliably vote Republican. Those blacks born in the United States naturally got the right under the 14th Amendment. Chinese residents could not become citizens until 1943, long after the 1868 14th Amendment. Second, with few exceptions, the 1875 Page Act during President Grant's administration did not allow Chinese women to immigrate into the United States. And the reason was to prevent American Chinese residents from having children because 90%, 95% of them were males who were not allowed under California law to marry whites. Third, between 1882 and 1904, a series of Chinese Exclusion Acts blocked Chinese immigrants of both sexes. Fourth, President Theodore Roosevelt's administration blocked most immigration from Japan. Now, and this happened in 1907 when Californians turned their objections about Asians toward Japan. In 1907, the Theodore Roosevelt's administration negotiated a so-called gentleman's agreement that stipulated that Japan would not issue passports to Japanese workers seeking to enter the continental United States. As a result of the preceding acts and the agreements that I mentioned, the percent of California's population that was Chinese American dropped from 9% in 1860 to 4% in 1990 and 2% in 1940. Almost none of them could vote until World War II. Californians also often suppressed Chinese Americans with many acts of violence, particularly in the 19th century. The Chinese Americans composed 2/3 of California's 300 lynch victims between 1849 and 1902. In fact, America's single biggest lynching happened in Los Angeles in 1871, again when President Grant was president, U.S. Grant was president. At that time, 17 Chinese Americans were killed in Los Angeles, including one woman. Now, prior to the above occurrences, Californians had long discriminated against Chinese Americans with restrictive conduct codes, similar to the so-called black codes that some southern states attempted but failed to implement after Appomattox. In order to discourage non-white gold prospectors, for example, California imposed a steep monthly foreign miners tax on Chinese Americans and other non-whites. Chinese were considered non-white. For almost 100 years after 1850, the state had laws on the books banning interracial marriage. Considering that white Californians engaged in blatant discriminatory actions and violence against Chinese residents who represented less than 9% of the state's population, it is simply not credible to argue that California whites would have failed to rebel had federal laws transformed blacks into most of that state's voters, even if blacks represented most of California's population. Now, I want to share a table to sort of make my point here. So let me do a screen share and pull this up. Here it is. Share. Okay, and then I want to enlarge it. Okay, so what you can see from this table is that California went from 9% Chinese American to 2% Chinese American between 1860 and 1940. Now, but look at what happened in Mississippi and South Carolina in terms of the percent of the population that was black. Black that prior to 1865, or yeah, 1865, were slaves. Okay, in 1860, Mississippi had 55% of the state population was black. Not until 1940, 80 years later, did blacks make up less than half of Mississippi's population. A similar situation in South Carolina, 59% black in 1860. Not until 1930 did blacks make up less than half of the population of South Carolina. So let me continue with my narrative. Even though California's Chinese residents fell from 9% to 2% from 1860 to 1940, most of South Carolina's population was black until 1930, as was most of Mississippi's population until 1940. Now, what that means is in a one-man, one-vote scenario, Mississippi and South Carolina would likely have been ruled by blacks from 1868 until at least the Great Depression and World War II, respectively. Now, given their inexperience and economic dependency, as well as a steep learning curve, is it at all credible? Let me ask, is it at all credible that a lengthy period of misrule could have been avoided in South Carolina and Mississippi if blacks had ruled during those long periods? Now, regardless of the black man's intelligence, industry, and good intentions, was an electorate that was that started off 97% illiterate, likely to avoid being misled by demagogues seeking to line their own pockets while throwing patronage crumbs to black voters? Booker T. Washington expressed his doubts when he said, quote, "In many cases, it seemed to me that the ignorance of my race was being used as a tool with which to help white men," meaning carpetbaggers, "into office, and that there was an element in the North which wanted to punish the Southern white men by forcing the Negro into positions over the head of Southern whites," close quote. Now, some people will say, well, Booker T. Washington, academics will probably say, well, Booker T. Washington, he was the Uncle Tom of that era. He was the Martin Luther King compared to the Malcolm X that showed up in the 1960s. Well, if you draw that analogy, then W.E.B. Du Bois, the black historian and black activist, would be analogous to Malcolm X. He was a much more radical than was Booker T. Washington. Well, here's what he said. Similarly, in 1897, Black historian and activist W.E.B. Du Bois wrote of his race, unless, quote, unless we conquer our present vices, they will conquer us. We are diseased, we are developing criminal tendencies, and an alarming percentage of our men and women are sexually impure. I believe the first and greatest step toward the settlement of the present friction between the races lies in the correction of immorality, crime, and laziness among the blacks themselves, which remain as a heritage from slavery. Close quote. Now that's W.E.B. Du Bois. That is not me. The important thing to keep here is that I'm not saying, and neither is Du Bois saying, that blacks don't have the endemic ability and endemic intelligence to make for good government. What he is saying is that for many years after the end of the Civil War, decades, they did not have the, they had a legacy of dependency, from slavery that interfered with their, and they had a steep learning curve to learn, and they were inexperienced. They had a steep learning curve to learn how to, if they were going to govern states, how they were going to do that in an objective way. W.E.B. Du Bois is saying that he's not criticizing his own race specifically for its endemic characteristics. No, he's saying it was a legacy of a dependency mentality that was associated with slavery for such a long time. Now, for those of you that want to learn more about this, I would recommend that you get my book, Southern Reconstruction, which is $22 at Barnes & Noble and Amazon and other bookstores. Or you can get my other book, U.S. Grant's Failed Presidency, which might be better termed U.S. Grant's Selfish Presidency, because he was serving himself during his 8 years in office, and he wasn't doing much for good for the country at all, and certainly not the South. Now, to get those books, both of them are like $22 at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. If you want autographed copies, you can get them from me, Philip Lee. But you need to, it would be $25, and I will pay the postage here in the States. You just need to email me, Phil, P-H-I-L _ Leigh, L-E-I-G-H at me.com. Okay, that's our show for today, and thanks for watching.